Hello, for the present activity, I will be speaking in English. My name is Lorraine O'Donnell. I'm from QUESCREN at Concordia University in Montreal. I'm pleased to present to you a roundtable called Heritage and Memory in the Eastern Townships. 3 people are here today to discuss the conference theme from the perspective of their work with key groups serving the English-speaking minority community in what we call the Eastern Townships, formerly known in Quebec as l'Estrie. The Townships is a region in Quebec south of Montreal. Our conference was meant to have taken place live in the Townships, and we had scheduled tours and other events in collaboration with the presenters at today's roundtable. Unfortunately, we had to go online, but very kindly, the 3 collaborators agreed to graciously attend an online panel instead, and we're very grateful for that. So let me introduce our 3 speakers. Rachel Hunting, a 9th generation townshipper. Rachel has expertise in community development and advocacy, governance in public sector institutions and organizations, and in official languages issues as they pertain to Quebec's English-speaking minority community. Rachel has been Executive Director of Townshippers Association since 2012, and she lives in Sherbrooke, Quebec. Grant Myers, our second presenter, is president of the Quebec Anglophone Heritage Network, and he has had a lifelong passion for history, material culture, and folklore. Grant's most recent work is entitled A Very Singular and Mortal Disease, Epidemic Meningococcal Disease in Early 19th Century New England and Quebec. Grant lives in Austin in Quebec. Fabian Phil. Since 2013, Fabian Phil has been Executive Director of the Eastern Townships Resource Center at Bishop's University. In the past, Fabian worked for several nonprofit organizations and German government agencies. Originally neither Anglophone nor Francophone, he tries to bridge both worlds in the Eastern Townships, which he now calls home. So the format for today's roundtable is as follows. Fabian has offered to briefly present the Townships region, and then I will ask our speakers a series of questions, 2 or 3 depending on time. And we hope to, at the end, open the floor for a question or 2 as well. So let's start with Fabian and his presentation on the Townships.
Well, thank you, Lorraine. Thanks for having me. I would not have thought a few years ago that I would participate in an Acfas conference. When we talked about this format, we agreed that it would make sense maybe to situate those of you who are not familiar with the Eastern Townships and its unique history. And therefore, I want to acknowledge that the Eastern Townships are situated on the unceded ancestral territory of the Wabanaki Nation. The Eastern Townships region, as we know it today, was mostly a traditional territory for the First Nations. The Abenaki were the indigenous group who occupied this territory and stemming from the broader Algonquin family. This group was semi-nomadic and relied on hunting, gathering for their daily living. And from the perspective of Native history, the territory of the Eastern Township, or what we call today the Eastern Townships, was not delineated in the way how we define it today. There was no permanent residence of the Abenaki here in the region, and it's difficult to establish specific areas of inhabitation. It is possible to refer to camp locations, refuge or retreats. Nevertheless, Bishop's University, we at the ETRC, and everybody considers the Abenaki Nation's ancestral lands here in the townships. The Eastern Townships are known to have a distinct cultural identity Very often when we talk about the Anglophone community in Quebec, the first picture that pops in mind is of course Montreal, but the geographic location here is largely responsible for something unique. It's a borderland territory that served as an intermediary between Canada and the United States for a long, long time. In the development of a local cultural identity, three different realities played a role. Firstly, the Eastern Townships acted as a relay to the New England states. Secondly, the region played an important role in the development of imperial dominance over the territory, thanks to the influence of colonial authorities. And finally, French-Canadian society would become to have an impact on this local identity as well. These three distinct factors related to time and space had a significant impact on the region's demographic profile, its culture and its economy, and that till today. The Eastern Townships are also known for the unique system of land occupation. The French tradition consisted in building seigneuries. These lands were subject to seigneurial rights. For the Eastern Townships, it was different. Colonial administration ceded lands in what was called free tenure or full ownership. Once an individual became owner of the land, he was free to dispose of it as he pleased. And this long established system dating back to the old American colonies appealed to the Americans, what we call today, some of them loyalists, who valued equality and this independence. And for some time, in the absence of a framework imposed by local authorities, these first American settlers would be self-sufficient by building their own roads and opening their own schools. In the 1840s, the region became more accessible to French-Canadian settlers. The roads were passable and industrialization, which increased the local demand for workers, attracted Francophones to the townships. Till that moment, the townships were in the remote east corner of Quebec and not a big center of politics or industries. A mass wave of Francophone settlers in the region changed the local demographic balance, and fairly absent at the beginning of the century, they formed much of a local population 100 years later. Throughout the 19th century, the Eastern Townships saw significant immigration and emigration. The various waves of migration, Americans, British, Scottish, Irish, French, Canadians, contributed to the development of the region. Likewise, we should not forget that, and it's also something we still see today, that there were also several waves of immigration and many left the area for the American and the Canadian West.
Yes, thank you very much. We will now turn to our first roundtable question, and I will start. I'll ask the question and I'll ask Rachel to be the first person to answer. So all of you work for community groups serving the English-speaking minority population of the townships. What do townships' history and heritage mean for your community? And if you like, for you personally? And what activities are your groups involved in on these themes of history and heritage? Rachel?
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. The organization that I work for, Townshippers Association, is a regional nonprofit that's been at work in the Eastern Townships since 1979, and it has a generalist mandate, so it does a little bit of everything. And in regards to history and heritage, one of the most well-known activities that our organization does is Townshippers Festival, or you may have known it as Townshippers Day. For about 37 years, it ran under the banner Townshippers Day. And in the recent past, we've kind of reoriented the festival so that it has more of an inclusive title, and the goal of that festival is actually to celebrate the heritage and the history in all of the different towns that make up the Eastern Townships. So it's quite a large geographical area if you think about it. In terms of geography, it's about the size of Belgium, and it's made up of a lot of small rural areas where the English-speaking community was very present in the past, and where some of our institutions and some of our more historical buildings are still there and are still at work in the community. And the idea is, from our organization's perspective, is working on the identity piece and the rooted feeling for young people to understand, you know, the contributions that our community made to Quebec's development, but to also the development of the area. And those kinds of activities and those kinds of identity pieces for us are helpful in keeping our young people in the region once they're educated and at the time in their lives where they're looking around for opportunities. And so that they feel rooted and feel connected to the Eastern Townships and to the culture.
Thank you, Rachel. I'll next turn to Grant Myers. So Grant, Quebec Anglophone Heritage Network is a heritage organization. So what have you found that Townships history and heritage means for your community? And what activities does Quebec Anglophone Heritage Network carry out?
Well, I'm fascinated by your question, Lorraine, and I've given it a lot of thought prior to speaking here today. And I have to agree with Rachel that I think townshippers are really rooted in a sense of place and in a sense of the past, because it surrounds us everywhere here. And I guess that's unlike like many places, but you really do get a sense of the past living here. I think everyone understands it in a different way. For example, I'm immersed in history and heritage on a daily basis through my volunteer involvement with the Quebec Anglophone Heritage Network. My children, for example, and their friends experience it differently, and they don't think about it on a day-to-day basis. But I think nevertheless, it is part of how they see themselves and how they identify themselves as townshippers and coming from this unique place. I'm an outsider. I mean, I've been here for 20-something years, but I'm originally from Northwestern Ontario. But if you ask me about my identity, I'd say, yes, I'm a townshipper. The Quebec Anglophone Heritage Network was actually founded in the townships 20 years ago. We are not exclusively a townships organization. We're an umbrella group that represents about 400 individual and institutional members across Quebec. But 50% of our board is from the townships, about a third of our membership. And you'll see in many of the activities that we do, the history and the heritage of the townships are well represented.
And now I'll turn to Fabian. So Fabian, tell us a bit about the Eastern Townships Resource Center and what history and heritage means in that context.
The ETRC is an archive center with the mission and the mandate to preserve the Anglophone heritage, what we call the historical Eastern Townships. So already by that, it means the heritage means all to us, because what we see a lot is that there are many also active historical societies here in the region, volunteer-based. But my sense over the last years is a little bit that there is a decline in this community because of age, because they're not. It's difficult for them to have a sustainable organization. And we see it over the last years that there's a decline in the historical societies. And with that, the big question of what happens to their documentary heritage that they preserve as well on a local base, what's happening to that? Very often, at 2-3 occasions, the ETRC was able to accommodate these archives and to integrate that in our collections. But sometimes I fear a little bit for this still existing heritage in which is in very bad conditions sometimes. So it's our mission to preserve that, but at the same time also to make it accessible to the public and to the community, not only to researchers who come to do academic research directly in the archives, but also over the last years we tried to share it with a broader public, to make this heritage, these archives, accessible through educational materials that we developed that are ready for primary and for elementary school and high school, or through low-level offers like podcasts or publications that are not focusing on an academic audience, but something for everyone. So it's our daily business to occupy ourselves with this question, and I sense it's still very important, and there's still a long way to go.
Thanks, Fabian. So before we organized this panel, I organized it with the three presenters, and we had a nice discussion, including one that led to this second question. All of you have talked about people, the relevance of history and heritage for communities from the region, and very much identified with the region of the townships. But how does your group, or how could it, adapt your activities so they're interesting and relevant for people who live in the region or visit the region, for whom the township's history and heritage are not their history and heritage? In other words, newcomers to the area, immigrants, and so on. Or, you know, we could even broaden the question, if you like. What are other challenges that your groups face? So I'll start with Grant.
Again, I really appreciate your question, and we at QUESCREN have struggled with this. There's a certain demographic, I think, that's interested in history and in heritage more than another, and it tends to skew upward. You know, those of us that are over 50, and so that question of engaging younger people, engaging youth in the history and the heritage of this region is a challenge. There's also a challenge in that the majority community is not English speaking, and so when it's not your history and heritage, it is difficult. Engagement is difficult. Although I have to say that we've had a number of very fruitful relationships with the Francophone heritage community, both in the townships and throughout Quebec. We need to adapt as an organization. I think we need to do a few things. I think we have to embrace new technologies, podcasting, videos, you know, those kinds of things. I think we also need to move away from macro history and into micro history, because that's where the fun is. The story of individuals and the messiness of life and the scandals and all of those types of things, I think, that make history exciting and interesting. And so I'm very excited to have an opportunity to work with QUESCREN on a number of projects, and I think those projects are moving in the right direction. Our talk series, I mentioned videos and podcasts. We're beginning to develop those on a number of very specific but very interesting themes. I think we also need to, and I mentioned it before, and I'll stress it again, I think we need to engage the majority community and embrace their history and heritage. The history of Quebec, whether it's English-speaking, French-speaking, or otherwise, belongs to us all, and we need to engage that in its entirety.
That's really interesting, Grant. I like how you broadened the question to include different generations and different generational attitudes that you have encountered in your work towards the very question of history and heritage. I'll turn now to Fabian. So Fabian, how does your group, or how could it, adapt activities to appeal to a broader audience, especially those for whom Townships history and heritage is not their personal history and heritage?
I agree with Grant that we should look a little bit sometimes more at the micro level and leave like the big paths of history of the townships, they are well known, but it's very often it's still a majority white masculine history that we are telling. And I also, with my institution, we took part in that in the past. But I think it's important to show that there were also other groups associated with the Anglophone community in the past here in the townships that we're not talking about a lot. I mean, we are not talking a lot about the Syrians that came in the beginning of the 20th century to the Sherbrooke area. We are not talking a lot about Black history in the Eastern Townships and slavery that existed in the Missisquoi area. I think that these are, especially in the current climate where people are interested in these stories, it's also a chance to attract people to these stories and to this part of history where it's very local and very, you can grasp it easily, and maybe interests also new people and newcomers that I don't feel myself being from Germany and only being since 2012 here in the townships. I don't feel as a townshipper in the sense like if I go see my neighbor who is a townshipper in this way. But at some point, I also would like to see that I'm a townshipper by myself, because I see these stories of that are more diverse than what we are telling at the moment.
Thanks very much, Fabian. And I just wanted to point out Grant and Fabian are being very modest, but I'll point out two projects among many that I think did really good job to reach out. One with QUESCREN, with the Quebec Anglophone Heritage Network, where Grant works. Where Grant is the president of the board. They had a very interesting series on Indigenous history in Quebec, and brought in Indigenous speakers to talk about specifics of the history, but also broader concepts of historical knowledge and sharing the historical knowledge and contested histories and how to negotiate some of those stories. And then Fabian has done a wonderful series of podcasts. He mentioned it very briefly, but also on a lighter note, a year or two ago had a great project on facial hair styles in the Victorian period. So he had on Facebook some fantastic historic photos of men's beards and mustaches, and I gather that was quite a popular initiative to bring in, to broaden the audience. So I'll turn now to Rachel. So Rachel, how does your group, or how could your group adapt your activities to appeal to people for whom the history and heritage isn't necessarily theirs, or maybe some other challenges that you're facing around these issues?
Well, I think Grant and Fabian hit the nail on the head in terms of broadening the conversation and making the subject matter more accessible to more groups of people and the wider community especially. And as I mentioned earlier, we've been trying to reorient our major festival, which is designed to kind of celebrate and highlight the English-speaking community's heritage in a particular area, or in the townships as a whole, but to do that in a way that makes newcomers and the Francophone community feel like it's a celebration of their heritage and and the wider culture as well, because there's so many communities that contributed to the founding of the townships and the building of Quebec as a province. And it's absolutely a misnomer to assume that it's just a heterogeneous, I don't want to use the wrong word, but just a community of majority white folk that did all of the community development and community building. The English-speaking community has started to describe itself as a linguistic community, but if you look back in the history of our community across the province, it's extremely diverse. And it's a very interesting group of individuals. So it's to make that accessible to younger people, and to also remove maybe some of the more traditional ways that we think about language and culture as well, and that celebrating English-speaking community in Quebec is not in conflict with celebrating French-speaking heritage and culture as well, and to kind of create those situations where we're working with partners from the newcomer community and from the Francophone community to find ways to celebrate together, I think is a winning formula, and to make use of new technologies, absolutely. And to also, in the community sector, work on the composition of our organizations, and the diversity and the age groups within our own groups, I think is something that we need to look at, and is something that's really helpful in expanding the vision of your organization past some of those maybe traditional ways we've thought of our community in the past, or we've worked with it formally. So those are things that Townshippers is looking at. How can we be more inclusive? How can we be better at telling the diversity of our stories? And I really like the idea, Grant, of the micro focus. That's something, just when you mentioned it, that personally I would be interested in knowing more of those individual stories, and getting more of a sense of that, the tapestry on an individual level, I think would be really rich addition to those maybe historical pieces we already know.
Thank you, Rachel. So my final pre-planned question to the three speakers, and I'll start, let's see, I'll start with Fabian this time. Fabian, what does all this mean for official language minority community vitality? In other words, how does doing a podcast or, posting pictures, interesting pictures of the community's past help build the vitality, the well-being of your community? And how could lawmakers and policy developers do a better job to support you in building vitality, if that is what you're able to do?
I think that these small activities like the Townshippers Festival, or what QUESCREN is doing, having a variety of offers, helps the community here in the region to have a sense of belonging. Like when I post images from our archives, and I see the comments under it of people knowing the place, starting conversations about people on the pictures, getting started. There we see this hits really a nerve, and it's important to the community. And it's not important what kind of background these people are having. If it's people who are faculty here at Bishops and consider themselves being part of the Anglophone community, or if it's in the really remote areas of the townships on a farm. I think these initiatives, it's important for the community. It's important that there are deep, diverse offers. Not everything. When I look at who's commenting on these pictures on Facebook, for example, it's not young people, to put it in this way. So I see there's a big challenge of keeping the young generation interested in the cultural heritage of the region, because they are most of the time really bilingual. They switch between Francophone and Anglophone world. Many of them are sadly that they're still leaving for better job opportunities than we can offer here in the townships, because we have to say that bilingualism does not really pay out here in the townships. I mean, if I'm perfectly bilingual, I will have much more chances to put this to work elsewhere in Montreal or in Ontario than here in the townships.
Now it's Rachel's turn to jump in. Rachel, what does all this mean for community vitality, and how can governments support you in building vitality through history and heritage?
Well, I think that support for initiatives that celebrate and instruct culture and vitality, or culture and identity for minority groups, whether they're linguistic or not, is important because it's supporting retention, it's supporting stability, sustainability sometimes, and just that rootedness, that connectivity to where you are, whether you were born here or whether you've moved here, having that sense of belonging that's rooted in a background, you know, that is somewhat interesting. I mean, not all history is always interesting, but it's very surprising when you start looking into the past and looking into those small rural areas, the stories that can come out of there, the human experience, the relationships between Francophones and Anglophones that have been developed in our region over the years. There's a lot to be learned, I think, as well, that can apply now. But I think that I would hope that governments and funders and stakeholders have an understanding that supporting historical initiatives and things that celebrate heritage are as important to the future of communities as they are to remembering the past, and remembering what was there before you. I think that it's especially important in the English-speaking community in Quebec, as our institutions change and as they're moved more and more into the majority community system. We are starting to lose some of those less visible markers for our heritage and our history. So the other components start to become a little bit more important when you can no longer physically see it. I think that some of the things that Grant's organization works on become important to keeping that narrative going for younger generations.
Thanks, Rachel. And then finally, Grant, what does this mean for community vitality, the work that QUESCREN does?
Just building on what Fabian and Rachel have talked about, we're still making history. We're making it every day, and I think the future of Quebec is in its diversity, and it really is its strength. And the Townships is an example of that. It's history. I think sometimes we think of history, at least in Quebec, as, you know, here's this Francophone group on one side, this Anglophone group on the other side, and, you know, they're monoliths. Well, the reality of the situation is that the diversity of the Townships has always been its strength. The reality is that there has never been a homogeneous set of norms, values, and expectations that have defined the past. And I think we need to find that diversity in the past and bring it forward to our understandings of the future. And I think that's I think Quebec is ready for that. I think Quebec is ready to step into a renewed vision of itself, and I'm really excited about that. And I think the Townships is one of the leading lights in that in that effort, because we are so interesting and diverse in terms of our past and even our present.
Thanks very much, Grant and Fabian and Rachel. I'm now going to turn to the questions in the Q&A box. So the first question I see is, are there still traces in Townshippers' identity today of older identities, such as American, Scottish, etc.? And do you take those older identities into account in your work?
I mean, I would say yes, the traces of those communities are still present in the Townships. If I think about my own family, we're American loyalists on one side and Irish, Scottish on the other. I think there's a lot of people that are in the area that would have a similar background as far as ancestors go. As far as how my organization would approach those kinds of specific histories, it's not something that Townshippers would focus on, you know, the particular American, Irish, or Scottish. It's, for us, we take kind of a more global approach to what we would think about in terms of Townshippers and Townships history. But I think Grant's organization and certainly Fabian's will have more to say about that, and maybe more information that's specific to those particular groups of people.
Well, for me, when we organize events, there is not one event where where someone is talking to me about, I'm Irish, or I'm 10th generation Irish, or my family, we are loyalists. And so that people are still saying that, they still identify with their origins. I don't think that beside of that we see a lot of that. I don't see that there's like a strong Scottish community that would present themselves here in the townships. In our work, when we do regarding the preservation of documents, of images, of all that, of course, that plays a role. And you will find all these roots in our archival materials.
Thank you, Fabian. I'm going to direct the next question to Grant. Grant, does your organization have positive relationships with the Eastern Township School Board or the English Cégep and Bishop's University, which is the local university in Sherbrooke? And how could they become even more positive?
Well, quite honestly, I think we have worked with the Eastern Township School Board in the past and continue through our student writing project. I have to say, though, I think there is an opportunity for us to form better relationships with post-secondary institutions in the townships, whether they be primarily English language institutions or Francophone institutions. And I think that's an area of opportunity, for us. And again, I know we have in the past worked with those institutions to varying degrees, but I think there's a lot more opportunity to do that. The challenge is we each have our different mandates and our things that we need to accomplish. And it's a matter of capacity and a matter of finding common ground, and we're certainly open to that.
These are small communities we're talking about here, in case that's not already clear to people. I have a question in French. Est-ce que vous croyez que cette fierté que vous cherchez à développer envers le patrimoine et la contribution de la communauté anglophone à la région des cantons de l'Est peut être partagée à la fois par la communauté anglophone et francophone? And the question writer added, Grant had already partly answered that question, but how can you bring in or work on mutual pride by the majority Francophone and minority Anglophone communities? Anyone want to jump in? We've got 3 minutes left.
Oh, go ahead.
You going, Grant?
Yeah, I'll go. Sorry, Rachel.
That's okay. It's like an auction. I brushed my hair. It could have been.
Yeah, I think, again, talking about the nature of the community, I think sometimes these distinctions almost become artificial. So many townshippers are invested in both the French and English-speaking parts of portions of the community. They're through their own family even. And so I think there is a great sense of pride in what everyone brings to the past and to our understanding of the past and the present. And I think for most of us, we want to celebrate the Francophone history as much as we want to celebrate the English-speaking history. It's a matter of negotiating the process of creating history and developing a realistic yet positive view of the future through that. And I think that's so important.
Si je peux me permettre, je vais répondre en français. Je trouve que c'est aussi important que ce l'est faisable. Puis je trouve qu'avec les générations plus jeunes, ils n'ont pas la même approche aux questions de langage et de patrimoine, de culture. Fait que les jeunes ont une vision de l'histoire qui est différente que ma génération, que celle de mes parents, que celle de mes grands-parents. Puis c'est pas nécessairement divisé sur des pôles linguistiques. Fait que je trouve que ça nous donne une occasion aussi ou des occasions de travailler avec ces groupes-là, puis ces cohortes de population-là, à savoir pour eux, c'est quoi leur expérience avec l'histoire, le patrimoine, la culture anglophone, francophone, québécoise. Puis c'est une conversation qui est super importante parce que ça aussi, ça aide avec la rétention de nos jeunes, le sentiment d'appartenance au Québec, au canton de l'Est, à la petite village, peut-être rural, dans laquelle tu as grandi. Mais oui, je pense que c'est possible, puis je pense que c'est ce qui va nous amener dans un avenir qui est plus inclusif aussi.
With that inspiring comment about vivre ensemble or living together, I want to thank our three speakers, Rachel Hunting, Grant Myers, and Fabian Ville, for kindly sharing your experiences working with community groups in the Eastern Townships of Quebec. It was really a wonderful discussion. And on this note, I will end the first of our two-day Acfas conference.